guys, and welcome to my channel. Today's video, I'm talking about some recent horror reads. Started off the month with AnybodyHome. Hated it. Absolutely hated this book. It put me into a weird funk, and I wish I never picked this one up. I was very excited to read this one. I think it's told in a third person omni something. I don't know the POVs and I don't feel like looking it up. But basically, it's this guy who's a seasoned home invader who is telling you how to become a home invader, how to do it successfully. And it's kind of like a manifesto. Loved the setup because I was getting funny games vibes. It centers around these group of home invaders who are planning their next big home invasion on this unsuspecting family, and they take you through the process of how they scope out the family beforehand, how they scope out the home and plant little things to help them in their process when the night comes. Then it shows you when they actually invade this home and torture this family and all that fun stuff. I just hated the writing style. I could not connect with it at all. It took me out of it. It just felt like so much talking. I just couldn't I was so bored and I was falling asleep at times, and I was like, can you just get to the torture? Like, let's just get to it, man. Painful for me to read, and I wish I didn't push myself to read it, but I was like, it's short. Maybe it will get better for me. No, it did not get better for me. And towards the end, I was just skimming through it. I don't even remember what happened in the end. I just know that they were torturing people, this family, and I was bored. That stuff shouldn't bore me. I should have been repulsed and upset, but I was more upset that I was reading the book. It was so hard to connect with anybody in this book because of the way the book is written. And I know it worked for some. Like, some people loved this book, gave it really high ratings. Did not work for me. Then I picked up another book that I have been highly anticipating to read. It's been on my TBR for a while. It's In the Miso Soup. So this book is interesting because it was published, serialized over the course of several months in a magazine before it was published into a book. It's a pretty short read. It's only like 200 pages, but there's only 3 chapters in it. So the chapters are insanely long, and also another one that's very talky. So this book centers on a young man in Japan who is a tourist of Japan's sleazy nightlife. So he gets hired right before New Year's Eve by this American tourist to take him around. At the same time, there's a series of murders happening. So he's starting to suspect that this tourist might be the person who is responsible. I loved the setup, and at the beginning of the book, you're just kind of learning more about this American tourist and learning about the murders that are happening, and you're getting more insight into this main character and hearing his inner thoughts and why he thinks this guy is weird. And there's a lot of dread and tension, and there's a lot of suspense there because you're like, okay, is he this murderer or is he not? And then the second chapter is where the book takes a turn, and it was like extremely violent and disturbing to read, and I was like, yes, this is what I signed up for, this is what I want. And then the third chapter, it kind of slows down a bit after all of that, and it was just weird. The way it was formatted was weird. But I can imagine how, like, on the edge of your seat these readers must have felt having to wait months in between chapters to find out what happened. I think there's a lot of cultural things in this book that I didn't fully understand because I'm not from Japan, so I think I missed a lot of things. It felt very philosophical at certain points, like the conversation between the American tourist and the Japanese guide, nightlife guide. It was making commentary about the culture in Japan and also the culture in America, sex culture and all of that stuff. It just didn't work for me as much as I wanted it to. I do want to read more from this author because they wrote Audition, which is an incredibly disturbing horror movie about a guy. He holds a fake audition to find his next girlfriend, and he finds the perfect woman, but she might not be who she claims to be. And he also wrote Piercing, which is another disturbing story about this guy who has these deep, dark desires to murder someone, and he hires an escort for the evening to fulfill those desires. But when he meets her, he learns that she might have some dark desires of her own, and it's a really messed up love story. So I do think that I'm going to check out more from this author. I didn't really like this one as much as I wanted. I think I was just expecting something completely different, but I do think it was well written. I do recommend it. I didn't love it as much as I wanted. Then we're getting into one of my new favorite books of the year, which I vlogged the whole experience. I will link to that up above, down below, wherever. I also talked about this in more detail with Gabby from Gabby Reads on her Book Troop live show in October, and that is Just Like Home by Sarah Gailey. It is so beautifully written, so dark, so disturbing, so unexpected, and it has some of the best characters and character development I've ever read. I loved it so much. So the story centers on a young woman who returns to her childhood home to deal with her ailing mother, who is basically about to die. And this home has a dark history because her father may have killed some people and buried the bodies on the property. And that's like the basic setup of this story. I don't think that's really a spoiler because it's in the plot summary. So the story is really delving deep into the relationship between our main character Vera and her mother Daphne, and we slowly over the course of the book learn about her relationship with her father and what happened while she was growing up. And it's really a story about monsters of all kinds. This one has some of the most intense scenes between characters I've ever read. The relationship between Vera and her mother is so dark because Vera's mother, Daphne, is a horrible person. She kind of felt like she was in competition with her daughter for the father's love, and she just treated her horribly. And there's a dinner scene where they're talking, and it is so intense. Like, I felt like I was reading stuff that I shouldn't have been reading. Like, it felt like I was walking in and on a personal conversation between a mother and daughter, and I was so uncomfortable, but I could not look away. Vera herself is such an interesting character because she comes off as very headstrong, and she's kind of like a spitfire. She's feisty and she's not afraid to express her opinion, but when she goes back home and interacts with her mother, she kind of reverts back to that little girl who is afraid of her mother. The learning about the relationship between Vera and her father was super interesting because her dad kind of did these awful things, but he still was a good dad to her in some way. And the book goes to unexpected places in the end, and I think the ending might throw a lot of people off because it's so bonkers and out there that it might not work for you, but I personally loved it because it's just unique. I love when authors take risks and do new things. There's a lot of symbolism throughout this whole book, but especially in the end. And I just thought the whole book was a really interesting look at trauma and abusive relationships. And it's just so good. I love this book. I definitely want to check out more from this author. Highly recommend. The next book I want to talk about is Ghost Eaters by Clay McLeod Chapman. Can we talk about the cover? I will never stop raving about this cover. This book will be facing outwards on my shelves because it's just so hauntingly beautiful. This story centers on a young woman whose best friend dies from an overdose, and she quickly learns that he was involved in some weird stuff where he was taking this drug called Ghost that allowed him to see the dead. So she decides to check it out for herself, and she gets pulled into this dark, mysterious world. The story deals a lot with grief, depression, drug addiction, and I really loved the setup. I loved the first half of this story so much. The beginning of the book was really emotional, and I almost was tearing up a bit because it's just focused on this group of friends who went to college together, and it's focused on this toxic relationship between this girl and her friend Silas, who is struggling with drugs, and she struggles with enabling him and feeling that guilt and trying to help him without enabling him, and then shutting him off at times to hope he gets better. Then he dies, and you watch her go through that grieving period, and it's really sad. She goes through the denial process of not accepting that he's dead and looking for ways to communicate with him and bring him back. And this drug, this mysterious drug element of the story is so fascinating, and I wish they would have explored that a bit more because we don't really learn a whole lot about this drug. We briefly do, but I would have loved to have learned more about how they discovered this drug. There's some really, really dark and disturbing imagery, and it was so horrific to read and just intense, where it might be a slight spoiler, but our main character, when she takes this drug, she starts seeing ghosts, but she sees them everywhere and no one else can see them, so she's seeing really horrific stuff, and they're kind of attracted to the drug that she's taking, so she's in immense danger and no one else knows what's going on. And the whole book felt like you were on a drug trip and you were going through the motions of withdrawal and needing that next fix, and it was really hard to read because those feelings aren't fun to have. So, but overall I really liked it. I do highly recommend it. I think it's worth a read. I think you have to be in a good headspace to read this though, because the stuff is kind of dark and tragic and not easy to read. So it might put you in a little bit of a depression, but I was already in one, so it didn't matter. Those are all the books I've read recently, but if you can recommend me some novellas, like books that are gonna catch me right away and hook me and mess me up, please recommend those. Let me know what horror books you've been reading lately, and thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll catch you next time.